Degrading treatment of transgendered people, refusing to marry same-sex couples, denying asylum to refugees endangered by homophobic laws, the most progressive LGBTIQ legislation in the world, and yet officials from Home Affairs continue shocking discrimination against the queer community. Why can't this department get it right? Tonight we get the answers from the Ministry's Acting Director General, Thulani Mavuso, and LGBTI activist Steve Letsika joins us from our Durban studio to give us a sense of the situation on the ground there. Good evening, welcome to both of you. Let me start off with you, Thulani Mavuso. I mean, why is this situation still in this unacceptable state?
Well, good evening and good evening to the viewers. Look, we amended the Civil Unions Act recently because there was a clause that allowed, for example, marriage officers who are state officials to have a choice whether they would want to marry somebody, from same-sex couple. So that legislation has been amended last year when the Fifth Parliament rose. That was dealt with by the Portfolio Committee. But the second issue relating to people who come to South Africa claiming asylum, obviously on the basis that they are persecuted in their countries of origin based on their sexual orientation. Again, we look at those cases, we process those cases. Obviously, you would have situations here and there where you'd find officials who do not understand, for example, the gravity of certain situations by those individuals, particularly when they're coming from countries whose laws are quite, negative towards that type of community.
But does it matter whether they understand the situation or not, because they are protected here in South Africa? They should be protected here in South Africa.
That's the point. Remember, obviously, our constitution is based on ensuring that everyone's human rights is protected. They are protected, but what I'm trying to say to you is that you've got to follow certain guidelines when you do some determinations. Obviously, our people are not the same. You would find them some people that you've trained them in terms of understanding the sensitivity of the issues that you're dealing with when somebody makes a claim on that particular basis. Actually, in 2012, the UNHCR provided guidelines, which in most instances as a country, and many countries of the world, I know the US, for example, they do that, we take into consideration some of the guidelines provided by the UNHCR, some of it even incorporated in our legislation. So that's what we've been doing. And also, I must say that, we've been engaging the LGBTI group, for the last 2 years. The former minister actually was quite active, Minister Gigaba, on this issue because a lot of issues were brought to his attention. So he needed us to ensure that we have even sort of a task team that we're working with them. I mean, I brought to you, for example, one of the media statements that we issued last year under the letterheads of one of the groups, which is Access Chapter 2, which brought many other organizations within the same space where we are agreeing on a number of issues that we need to deal with, including the review of the interview process, to make that determination by refugee status.
Okay, let me just stop you there for a moment. Steve, I believe you were one of those involved in meeting with Minister Gigaba, raising concerns about how people from your community are being treated there. Tell us what it is that you are experiencing. Firstly, let's deal with the foreigners coming in and the situation here in South Africa.
No, thank you so much, and thanks for the input given by the DG. It is indeed, I led the delegation from, the LGBTI, but also my organization, where we brought in various issues, particularly also around migrant refugees and asylum seekers. And in fact, Jane, just about 2 weeks ago, we released a report, the Voice report, which is actually tracking the narrative of experiences faced by LGBTI refugees and asylum seekers. One of the findings that is striking, it's about the documentation that people have. We have about 56% of refugees and asylum seekers with temporary documents. In fact, it's temporary asylum. And what has been a concern, it's the duration it takes for the department to issue, legal documents where people can continue with their life. The biggest issue that we have really raised in the report was the 86% of asylum seekers and refugees have been asked to prove their sexual orientation. And I think these are the issues that we have brought to the
what
department.
exactly does that mean? I mean, what do they expect them to do?
You see, this is the biggest challenge, and I do think officials within the department have really, we have to hold those officials to account, because it's actually insensitive and unconstitutional to ask somebody to prove their sexual orientation. Actually, it is unacceptable. So the department is aware of these issues, because we've brought it, to their attention, particularly in the office of the minister, but also the office of the DG, to saying these are the concerns that we have, and that must be arrested urgently.
Okay, Thulani Mavusa, I mean, what has been done to those who say, prove that you are gay? What has been done to those who clearly are not understanding that the situation needs to be handled sensitively and listening to the change of law?
Well, first of all, I must say, as you said, the legal instrument is there in terms of the law. But the second part, obviously, deals with the type of questionnaire, because the official has to follow those questions that are set. It's not a question of bringing their own questions into the process. But I must also say that one of the reasons I said earlier is to look at the laws of the country, but also there are certain individuals, for example, who come from certain countries where there's even media reports. They need to prove that actually there is they have founded fear that actually they are going to be either physically harmed, or they're actually saying that...
But you know this from a lot of countries in Africa.
Yes, well, we do know
that it's illegal that they...
That is why we're sensitive, particularly to those who come from certain countries. I know Kenya is one of those countries, Uganda is one of those countries, but it's just not a question of a blanket approval. I mean, if you are saying to us that mainly because the law says 1, 2, 3, any person who comes up, you just have to say, oh, in that category. Just imagine, how many people you'll have. Let me just say something. Part of the problem that we have in this country with asylum seeker regime is that we allowed it to be abused by economic migrants. Now, those who are supposed to benefit from the protection, they are not getting the protection, because everybody come and claim asylum. In 2010, we received over 200,000 applications for asylum, which was unprecedented, because the system of the asylum seeker management system was not created for such huge numbers. That's why we still have a huge backlog. We went to explain that to the Human Rights Commission 2 weeks ago, to say we're sitting with over 150,000 cases that we still need to finalize, because the legislation at the time required that members of the Refugee Appeals Board must sit as a quorum in order to hear these cases.
Okay.
We've since amended the law, so we just need the minister to sign the new regulations so that at least the Refugee Appeals Board can reduce the numbers, and then we've said that the UNHCR has helped us with the backlog project that we are currently working.
Okay, Steve, let's move this on to one of the biggest problems here, same-sex couples and the sort of problems and treatment that they are faced and the impact that it has on their children, if they have any.
You see, I think one is that if you're talking even about, these are civil rights that we're also talking about here. And if you're talking about same-sex couples that wants to get married, and wanting we cannot have marriage officers who wants to really undermine the Constitution and the law. The opt-out, as the DG has indicated, it's something that was taken by the Portfolio Committee last year. But however, the exercising of these in all the Home Affairs Station must be practical, because Batopili principles is there, and it must be practical that laws that are put to be exercised by citizens must be exercised by citizens. And I think that is the deepest challenge. Accountability is a big gap, which is something that we're seeing in Home Affairs offices.
And tell us the sort of impact that it has on the way people live. I mean, transgender people, they're having a long time. They're apparently complaining about not being able to get their ID documents in time. So therefore, they're sort of in the middle of nowhere, aren't they? They can't open bank accounts. They're held back.
Jane, we're sitting with 90% of transgender women who have not applied for their gender marker, which means people are sitting with IDs that do not match their identity or expression. And it's a biggest issue. And this is the report that we released even again last week when we launched in Pretoria. And this report is telling us that people aren't able to go because of the duration, because of the secondary victimization and discrimination they face. And I do think that Home Affairs must really confront this urgently. We can't, in 25 years, we are still talking about sensitive people, we are dealing with sensitive issues. We can't be, and when it comes to service provision, talk about sensitivity. It's unacceptable. Any service provision that is there must follow its own due diligence processes, which is the law, which is the regulation, which is the legislative framework. Citizens in South Africa can't be treated as second class. Irregardless, our sections of our constitution speaks about non-discriminative clause, which means any person we put on services cannot discriminate people on the basis of their sexual orientation, cannot discriminate people on the basis of their gender identity. And here is a classic example of transgender persons. People apply and it takes long. People apply for marriage and people are turned away. So these are issues. Of course, this can be raised, and I think we as organization work hand in hand to say, the department, we are here to assist where we can, but I think the obligation must still be met by the department.
Okay, Thulani, briefly, if you will, how is that going to be addressed? Because that's been an ongoing issue and clearly the training's not working there.
Well, we have a few cases that I know about. Some of the cases get reported to the media, but when you go deeper in looking for records, actually there's no such applications. So it's important that I think when we make reference, it should be cases that do exist. Because, you know, sometimes the hype created in the media, you'd assume that we sit every day and do nothing. You know, while when you look at the statistics, actually, you'll be seeing that in all the areas of our responsibilities, there's a huge number of work that, you know, there's a number of projects and activities that are happening. But where obviously we're supposed to be brought in because specifically someone has been discriminated, we then obviously have to come in. I do know that those incidents do happen. I mean, I try to address the issue of the transgender, and there's a clear what we call guidelines that we have issued to our officials on how to deal with those cases, because some people do not go and do an operation. It's a natural progression where somebody changes in terms of their gender orientation. So those are the kinds of things that are written in our processes, you know, that are there. Obviously, all I'm saying, it will be better now, I think, as we're working with these groups, for us to set up at least an office, you know, in our head office, so that a desk, so that they can be able to liaise with, if there are specific cases that relates to a certain office within, you know, Home Affairs, because we cannot afford, obviously, you know, to set an office all over the country, but we could set up one office, and I think we'll try and do that when we engage with them in the next round of engagement in the task team, because we do want to resolve this issue once and for all, to say they must have an escalation, what we call capability. If we create that for them, at least we'll be able to contain the situation while we continue, because our society is changing slowly, but not at the pace we require it to change.
All right, Thulani, Mavusa, Steve, let's take it. Thank you very much.